the courtroom froze. Not a whisper, not a shuffle, just the crack of Judge Amy Coney Barrett's words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. She leaned forward from the bench, eyes narrow, voice sharp as a blade. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you even understand the law?" Gasps rippled across the chamber. Supreme Court Justice had just cut down an elected representative in front of the cameras. And in that instant, the air turned electric. For many watching, it wasn't just a question. It was an accusation, a dismissal, a public attempt to humiliate a rising voice. Reporters craned forward, pens racing, sensing headlines. The jury glanced uneasily at one another. Even the clerks behind Barrett froze, caught between awe and disbelief. Here was the nation's most powerful court, and at its center, one of its most conservative figures. Throwing down a gauntlet before the country's eyes, Barrett's words weren't random. They carried years of weightan embodiment of privilege, authority, and an unspoken message. Know your place. For some, it was thrilling, the kind of dominance they expected from the bench. But for others, immigrants, women, people of color, those who had clawed their way into spaces once closed, off it felt like a gut punch, and at the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett. Cornered, spotlight blazing, her every move magnified. The justice had spoken as though daring her to stumble, daring her to fold under pressure, daring her to prove that this seat at the table was too heavy for her shoulders. The silence that followed was deafening. Would Crockett stammer? Would she retreat into rehearsed politeness? Or would she absorb the blow and carry on quietly, as so many before her had been forced to do? Every camera lens in the room locked onto her face. Millions watching at home leaned in, breath caught in their throats. This was more than a courtroom exchange, was a collision of worlds. The voice of entrenched power against the rising. Defiance of a new America. And then, as the pause stretched to its breaking point, the unexpected happened. Crockett lifted her head, her eyes steadied, her lips parted, and with a calm born not of privilege, but of survival. She spoke. The sting of Barrett's question didn't fade, it deepened. Viewers weren't just seeing a legal sparring match. They were witnessing a moment that cut to the very heart of democracy itself. Because this wasn't just about whether Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett understood the law. It was about who gets to decide whose voice counts in America. Barrett, cloaked in the black robe of the Supreme Court, carried an aura of untouchable authority. Her words dripped with institutional weight, the kind that has silenced generations before they could even rise. To many, she embodied the unspoken arrogance of power, authority used not as a shield for justice, but as a weapon to intimidate. And opposite her sat Crockett. No robe, no lofty bench, no decades-long tenure. Just a congresswoman representing ordinary citizens, teachers, single mothers, immigrants chasing their first shot at security, young activists who believed in the fragile promise of equality. Her presence in that courtroom was a reminder that power didn't always wear a robe or sit above the crowd. Sometimes it stood shoulder to shoulder with the people who had been overlooked for far too long. The clash between the two women crystallized something bigger than procedure. It was generational. It was cultural. It was America asking itself a raw question. Do we still believe that truth can come from anywhere, only from those already seated on high? Because if Barrett's tone carried one message, it was this: justice belongs to the gatekeepers. That the law is a fortress guarded by insiders who get to decide who may enter. But Crockett's very existence defied that. She represented the millions who had been told they were too loud, too inexperienced, too emotional to lead. She wasn't just holding her ground, she was holding their ground. The media knew it instantly. Tweets exploded, headlines drafted, themselves in real time. This wasn't about a technicality in a trial anymore. It was about a collision of philosophies. Barrett's question wasn't just sharp, it was symbolic. A test of whether America would bow again to the familiar hierarchy, or whether someone like Crockett could stand her ground and redefine what authority looks like. And here's the part that electrified viewers. Crockett didn't flinch. Every second she remained calm was a second that chipped away at the performance of dominance. Every breath she held steady was a reminder that arrogance wasn't invincible. She didn't have Barrett's robe, but she had something else. Credibility. Earned in the grit of community, in the stories of people left out of the system Barrett represented, this wasn't just about a case. It was about who gets to define justice in America. Do the rules belong only to the elite, or do they bend toward the people who live with the consequences of those rules every day? That was the question now hanging in the air, and for the millions glued to their screens, the suspense was unbearable. If Crockett folded, it would confirm every stereotype proof that the system could still shrink bold voices down to size. But if she answered, and answered with truth sharper than Barrett's blade, it wouldn't just rattle the courtroom. It would send shockwaves through the entire country. Long before that courtroom exchange, Amy Coney Barrett had been more than just a judge. She had been carefully sculpted into a symbol. Rise to the Supreme Court was meteoric, almost unnaturally. So, nominated and confirmed in record speed. Her appointment was cast as a triumph for one side of America and a blow to the other. She didn't ascend into her robe as a neutral jurist carried by consensus. She was vaulted into the seat as a weapon in a partisan war. Her story was always packaged neatly for public consumption. A mother of 7, devout Catholic, a scholar, who spoke softly but carried the steel confidence of someone certain that history bent in her direction. Yet beneath the polished exterior lay the contradictions that made her so polarizing. She spoke of fidelity to the Constitution, of impartiality, and humility. But to her critics, those words often disguised a rigidity that bent toward one ideology again and again. When the cases touched women's autonomy, workers' rights, or the fragile protections of marginalized groups, her rulings revealed not neutrality, but alignment with the same forces that had lifted her into power. Barrett was, in many ways, the embodiment of conservative dominance in the judiciary. Her very presence on the bench was a reminder that power had not just been seized, but cemented. It wasn't simply that she was appointed, it was how she was appointed through maneuvers that left millions convinced that fairness had been trampled in service of raw political gain. She became less a jurist and more a monument, standing tall as proof that one ideology could, with enough force, write itself into permanence. That permanence radiated in her courtroom demeanor. Barrett's sharp eyes cut quickly to the heart of an argument, but her tone always controlled, often dismissive, revealed the hierarchy she inhabited. When those before her faltered, she did not lift them up. She pressed harder, testing not just the argument but the person presenting it. For those aligned with her worldview, the sharpness softened. For those who dared to dissent, it hardened into a blade. It was this contradiction, her constant invocation of neutrality while embodying partisanship, that made her so dangerous in the eyes of her critics. She claimed she was above politics, yet her very robe was stitched with the fabric of political strategy. She insisted her faith was private, yet it hovered over her public rulings like a shadow. She told the world she was a servant of the Constitution, yet her interpretations often seemed less like service and more like control. Too many, Barrett's smile was a mask, a courteous facade, concealing the machinery of an ideological agenda. And that mask was most visible in moments like this one, where the weight of her title allowed her to lean in and cut down those who dared speak with a different voice. Her question to Crockett wasn't merely rhetorical, it was a demonstration. Do you even understand the law? It wasn't just a legal query, it was a performance of authority. A signal to everyone watching that she believed the robe made her untouchable. But this performance had consequences. Because every time Barrett wielded her authority with such dismissiveness, she also reminded people of how precarious justice felt under her watch. For some, she represented the stability of tradition. For others, she was the very embodiment of a system designed to keep power concentrated in the hands of a few, and that's why this clash mattered. Crockett wasn't just sparring with a judge. She was staring down the figurehead of an entire structure that had, for too long, told ordinary citizens to sit quietly while decisions were made for them. Barrett's sharp demeanor, her ability to reduce dissent to dust with a single phrase, wasn't just her style, it was her strategy. A strategy rooted in control, and signaling that those outside her circle could question but never truly disrupt. The danger of Barrett's presence on the bench wasn't just in her rulings. It was in the chilling effect her authority carried. If she could so easily diminish an elected congresswoman in full view of the nation, what chance did the unseen, unheard citizens have when their rights were on the line? She was, in many ways, the perfect antagonist for this moment. Regal yet rigid, courteous yet cutting. A symbol not just of conservatism, but of its entrenchment within the highest levels of power. And on this day, in this courtroom, she carried herself as though the outcome was already sealed, that her voice would drown out all others, that her blade-sharp question would puncture Crockett's resolve and reduce her to silence. It was the confidence of someone who believed the story had already been written, that the robe, the title, the history of her ascent would be enough to secure obedience. And for a moment, as the air thickened and silence held, it seemed she was right. But then, as the eyes of the room fixed on Jasmine Crockett, something began to shift. The congresswoman didn't bow, didn't shrink, didn't falter. She breathed. She steadied herself. And in that breath was the promise of something Barrett hadn't accounted for, the power of a voice unafraid. Asterisk before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in that courtroom, before the cameras and the headlines, she was already forged in fire. She didn't come from privilege, nor was she ushered into power by family connections. She was raised in the heartbeat of Texas, in communities where struggle wasn't abstract, it was daily life. Her earliest lessons weren't about legal theory. They were about survival, fairness, and what it means to fight when the odds are stacked against you. As a young girl, she watched her neighbors work double shifts just to keep the lights on. She saw families like her own, counted out by a system that promised equality but delivered excuses. From the very beginning, Crockett carried those images with her, the worn faces of people who deserved better, the quiet strength of those who refused to be broken. It lit a fire in her, one that would guide every step forward. When she chose law, it wasn't about prestige, it was about purpose. Law school wasn't easy. She wasn't the student who inherited doors already open. She was the student who had to pry them open with grit and sleepless nights. She balanced coursework with jobs that kept her afloat, all while proving wrong the people who underestimated her. Professors would later admit they were stunned not because she was loud, but because she was relentless. Every case study, every mock trial, every debate, she treated as if real lives depended on it. For her, they always did. That urgency carried into her career as a civil rights attorney. Crockett wasn't interested in safe, easy cases. She went where others hesitated, representing clients whose voices were silenced by power and prejudice. She stood against police misconduct, systemic inequality, and barriers designed to keep people locked out of justice. There were times when she walked into courtrooms and felt the weight of being underestimated. Judges looked past her, posing. Counsel dismissed her. Reporters ignored her. But then she spoke, and silence would fall. Because her command of the law wasn't just sharp, it was personal. She wielded it like a shield for the people she represented. Her colleagues called her fiery. Her opponents called her dangerous. Those who truly knew her understood. Her strength wasn't recklessness. It was rooted in discipline. Crockett prepared, studied, and sharpened herself like steel. Every attack made her tougher. Every dismissal only fueled her. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was trying to make the law serve those who had been denied its protection for far too long. There were sacrifices, too. Late nights meant missed family moments. Campaign trails meant being a target of insults that cut deep, especially as a black woman in politics. She endured being caricatured, underestimated, even ridiculed, but Crockett never folded. Herself with a balance of humility and fire, knowing that each insult revealed more about her detractors than about her. What truly defined her wasn't just resilience, but empathy. She remembered names, stories, details. To her, constituents weren't case numbers or statistics. They were people she'd grown up with. People who could have been her own family. She walked into Congress not with a sense of entitlement, but with the weight of those stories pressing against her shoulders. She wasn't there to climb the ladder. She was there to break it down and rebuild it so others could rise, to dot and sew. When she stepped into the chamber that day and faced the piercing glare of Judge Coney Barrett, Crockett wasn't intimidated. She'd faced worse: biased judges, stacked juries, hostile crowds. But never before had the scrutiny been this sharp, this national, this historic. A Supreme Court justice, wielding the gavel of authority against her, wasn't just another opponent tit. It was the embodiment of the very imbalance she had fought her entire career to challenge. Yet Crockett did not tremble. She straightened her back, steadied her breath, and locked eyes with Barrett. For all the privilege Barrett carried, Crockett knew she had something greater: the lived truth of struggle. The unshakable moral clarity that comes from walking through fire and surviving. This wasn't arrogance. It was earned conviction. She had faced tougher rooms than this, courtrooms where the odds were impossible, rallies where the threats were real. She had never walked away. And now, standing under the unrelenting glare of national cameras and the scrutiny of one of the highest seats of power in America, Crockett knew everything in her journey had prepared her for this very moment. The room was tense before the first word was spoken, but once Barrett leaned forward, her voice cutting like polished steel, the atmosphere shifted from charged to combustible. She wasted no time setting the tone. Counselor Barrett began, her tone wrapped in feigned civility, but sharpened with unmistakable condescension. Perhaps you can explain in precise statutory language how your position aligns with precedent. In light of the Chevron deference, if you're familiar with it, gasps flickered across the chamber. It wasn't a question, it was a trap designed to belittle. Barrett wasn't just challenging Crockett's argument. She was challenging her legitimacy. Crockett didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, listening with the stillness of someone who understood the power of silence. But Barrett wasn't finished. She pressed again, faster now, layering jargon with surgical intent. How do you reconcile your stance with Nifla v. Becerra? And what of whole woman's health v. Hellerstedt? Surely you're not suggesting this body discard decades of precedent for the sake of rhetoric, are you? The cadence was deliberate, the tone dismissive. To the untrained eye, it looked like an academic sparring match. But everyone in the chamber could feel the imbalance of power. A Supreme Court justice, armed with the authority of the bench, lobbing technicalities like daggers toward a congresswoman who, in that moment, was expected. Twofold. Whispers spread across the room. Staffers exchanged glances. Some shook their heads, others smirked, waiting for Crockett to stumble. Barrett smirked faintly, sensing momentum. She leaned back, her voice now colder, stripped of politeness. Or is it possible, Representative, that your arguments are more passion than principle? More performance than jurisprudence? The words landed with a thud. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Cameras zoomed in. Social feeds lit up in real time, hashtags forming before the next sentence even left Barrett's lips. Commentators were already typing, "Barrett schools Crockett. Supreme Court brilliance on display. Crockett out of her depth." Through it all, Crockett remained silent. Her hands rested neatly on the desk, her gaze steady, her breathing. She wasn't rattled. But to those watching the gallery, the press, the millions online, it looked as though she was cornered. Barrett, sensing blood in the water, doubled down. "You see, Representative, this is precisely the danger of conflating activism with law. It may stir applause, but it collapses under scrutiny. The Constitution doesn't bend to feelings." "And the law," she said, her voice tightening like, "a vice is not theater." The tension was electric. Every eye in the room shifted between Barrett's composed aggression and Crockett's calm stillness. Was she truly overwhelmed? Or was she waiting? For a long moment, Crockett did nothing, just breathed. A quiet strength radiated from her stillness, but the suspense was unbearable. The audience leaned forward, sensing something unscripted unfolding. Barrett, impatient, went for the kill. "If you cannot articulate, here and now, how your interpretation survives strict scrutiny, then I suggest this body dismiss your claims for what they are: political rhetoric dressed in legalese." Oh. The words hung in the air like smoke. Too many, it looked like the end of the debate. Barrett had cornered her with layered precedent, suffocated her with jargon, and dismissed her credibility in front of a national audience. Crockett sat motionless, absorbing the blows. And yet there was something in her eyes. Not defeat, but calculation. A flash. A spark. Those who knew her recognized it instantly. The cameras caught it too. A murmur spread through the chamber, not of mockery, but of anticipation. The silence after Barrett's last jab stretched into eternity. Cameras lingered on Crockett's face, searching for cracks, for hesitation, for proof that the justice's barrage had landed fatal blows. Barrett leaned back slightly, the corners of her lips tightening with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had already won. The room buzzed with the faint hum of anticipation, the kind of charged stillness. Before a lightning strike, and then Crockett moved. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her pen down on the desk in front of her, folded her hands, and lifted her gaze directly toward Barrett. Her voice, when it came, was calm but edged with steel. Justice Barrett Crockett began, her words cutting cleanly through the air. You've asked me whether I can articulate how my interpretation survives strict scrutiny.
Oh.
Let's start there. She paused, just long enough for the audience to lean in. You cite Niflavi. Becerra as though it were a trump card. But that case was about compelled speech, whether the state could force crisis pregnancy centers to post certain messages. Now, my position doesn't compel anyone's speech. All it affirms their rights. It protects citizens from having their liberty stripped under the guise of neutrality. To conflate the two is not only inaccurate, it's misleading. The chamber stilled. Barrett's expression, carefully composed, flickered for the briefest second. Crockett pressed forward. He also mentioned Whole Woman's Health v. Hellerstedt. That case struck down laws designed to look medically necessary, but which actually imposed undue burdens on women's access to health care. The precedent there is crystal clear when the state disguises discrimination as regulation. This court has an obligation to reject it. That principle doesn't undermine my argument, it strengthens it. Gasps, murmurs, Crockett's delivery was measured, precise. Every citation, a scalpel undoing Barrett's broad strokes of dismissal. She leaned in, her voice low but resonant, and Chevron deference. With respect, Justice, you know as well as I do that Chevron is not a blank check for agencies, nor does it strip Congress of its authority. It recognizes complexity, and it respects expertise. But even if you wanted to invoke Chevron here, it would still support the argument that agencies, empowered by the people's representatives, must act within constitutional bounds. Not above them, not outside them, within them. Barrett shifted in her chair, her eyes narrowing. The first time she looked less like the orchestrator of a performance, more like someone realizing she had underestimated her opponent. Crockett didn't let up. Her voice sharpened, her cadence deliberate. You've accused me of confusing passion for principle, activism for law. But let's be clear. The Constitution was not written to protect the powerful from critique. It was written to protect the powerless from oppression. When you invoke precedent selectively, when you reduce the lived experience of millions of Americans to footnotes and abstractions, you're not defending the law, you're distorting it. The words struck like a hammer. The gallery erupted in whispers. Staffers who had been smirking earlier now sat frozen. Crockett continued, her voice growing in force, not with rage but with conviction. I grew up in a country where the law was often wielded not as a shield, but as a weapon against the poor, against women, against communities of color. I became a civil rights attorney because I saw the gap between what the Constitution promises and what ordinary people experience. And I stand here today not because I confuse activism with law, but because I refuse to let law become a tool for silencing those who most need its protection. For a moment, Barrett's expression betrayed something, a flicker of irritation, perhaps even unease. Her usual composure faltered under Crockett's steady gaze, and then it came, the thunderclap. Crockett leaned forward, her voice resonant, clear enough for every microphone, every camera, every screen across the nation. Justice isn't defined by the powerful speaking down to the people, she declared, her hand pressing lightly on the desk as if to anchor the weight of her words. It's defined when the people finally speak back. The chamber froze. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No movement, no noise, just silence. A silence so total it felt physical, pressing against the walls, filling the air. Barrett blinked, her lips parting slightly as if to respond, but no. Words came, and then the reactions began. From the gallery, a ripple of applause, hesitant at first, then growing, though quickly hushed by security. Journalists scribbled furiously, some abandoning their notes to type live into feeds that were already exploding. Crockett fires back. Barrett rattled. This is history. Even among the lawmakers in the chamber, there was a visible shift. Some leaned back, stunned. Others exchanged quiet nods, as though acknowledging they had just witnessed a turning point. Barrett tried to compose herself, smoothing the papers in front of her, but the moment was already gone. The balance of power had shifted. For the first time in the exchange, she was no longer the unquestioned authority towering over the room. Crockett had met her on equal footing, and in that instant had risen higher. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or raise her voice. She simply sat back, hands folded, eyes steady. Her restraint was as powerful as her words. Barrett cleared her throat, fumbling for a line of retreat. Representative I, but the interruption only amplified the silence that followed. Cameras caught the slight tremor in Barrett's voice, the subtle tightness in her jaw. The justice, who had moments earlier pressed with relentless precision, now looked, if only for a moment. Visibly rattled in living rooms across America, viewers felt it. Oh, the news alerts flashed within seconds. Crockett turns tables. Supreme Court justice caught off guard. Clips spread across TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, playing the thunderous line again and again. In the chamber, the energy was undeniable. Some applauded quietly, others simply sat stunned, unsure how to process what had unfolded. But everyone knew. They had witnessed something seismic. Crockett glanced around the room, her expression calm, almost serene. She wasn't there for applause. She wasn't there for headlines. She was there to make a point, and she had made it, undeniably. UNFORGETTABLY. The camera zoomed in one last time as she folded her notes. The faintest trace of a knowing smile on her lips. The gavel had barely struck before the trial. Spilled into the court of public opinion? Within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's thunderous yet measured response to Justice Barrett began ricocheting across social media platforms. TikTok, teens, political junkies, and even casual scrollers were all swept into the storm. Edits. Appeared within the hour slow-motion shots of Crockett's final line set against swelling orchestral music. Text overlays declaring truth just spoke back. On Twitter, the hashtags came like a tidal wave. Hashtag Crockett vs. Barrett, hashtag Justice Speaks, and hashtag Mic Drop Moment. Overnight, Crockett's name trended not just in Washington, but in Los Angeles, New York, and even internationally in London and Toronto. Memes mocked Barrett's raised eyebrows and flustered expression. Others celebrated Crockett's unshakable calm, captioning her still frame with lines like, "This is what leadership looks like." Celebrities joined the chorus. Ava DuVernay retweeted the clip with the words, "This is cinema, but it's real life." John Legend posted, "Jasmine Crockett just reminded us what courage looks like under fire." Activists across movements from voting rights groups to immigrant justice. Networks saw in Crockett's composure a beacon for their own struggles. Cable news ran the exchange on repeat, dissecting every gesture, every pause. Some conservative outlets tried to frame Crockett as disrespectful, but their spin faltered under the sheer force of the viral moment. Mainstream commentators called it a historic turning point, comparing it to the iconic congressional clashes of the past, moments that cemented reputations and rewrote political trajectories. But what made this different was not just the confrontation itself, was who Crockett represented. For millions watching at home, she was no longer just a Texas congresswoman. She had become a symbol, a black woman standing tall against the dismissiveness of institutional power. The image of her steady gaze meeting Barrett's condescension was shared with captions like, "For every time we've been talked down to, this one's for us." Politicians rushed to comment. Progressive leaders praised her. Even moderates who normally avoided sharp takes found themselves compelled to weigh in. "Crockett stood for all of us today," one senator tweeted. The symbolic weight grew heavier. By the hour, this wasn't just about a single courtroom spar. It was about power dynamics. America knew too well who gets to define truth, and who is expected to sit down and be silent. And Crockett. For years, she had been known in activist circles, respected in legal communities, admired by grassroots organizers. But now her recognition leapt beyond regional borders.
No longer was she simply
Dallas fiery Congresswoman, she was a national figure, her name echoing in households far beyond Texas. Yet in the whirlwind of celebration, Crockett herself did not bask in the glow. When reporters caught her outside the courthouse, she brushed aside questions of personal victory. "This was never about me," she said simply. "It's about justice. It's about the people who can't be in that courtroom but whose voices still matter." And that was the crux. For Crockett, the viral fame, the hashtags, the headlines, they were secondary. What she had done, and what millions had witnessed, was not a performance for glory. It was a refusal to let arrogance masquerade as authority. But even as she walked away from the cameras, one thing was clear. Something in the nation's mood had shifted. People felt it in their bones. This wasn't just a moment of political theater, it was the spark of something bigger. And yet as the world celebrated her, Crockett carried a different weight. Because to her, this was never just about winning an argument. It was about planting a seed of dignity, of truth, of power reclaimed. She didn't see it as her victory. She saw it as a signal, one that America desperately needed to hear. But what Crockett didn't know then was that this moment, replayed and shared millions of times, was about to ignite a movement larger than even she imagined. When the noise of the headlines and hashtags began to fade, rose above the not in anger but in clarity. She made it clear that what had happened in that courtroom wasn't about embarrassing Justice Barrett or winning a viral moment. It was about something deeper, something enduring. This was never about humiliating anyone, Crockett told a group of young students who asked her about the exchange. It was about standing for truth, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it feels impossible. And that became the true lesson that echoed long after the cameras were gone. This was not the story of a clapback, but the story of dignity. Meeting arrogance, calm, courage, facing down theatrics. Barrett had leaned on power, on posture, on centuries of hierarchy that assumed authority could override truth. Crockett leaned on principle, on the Constitution, on lived experience, on the unshakable belief that justice belongs to the people. One looked downward, speaking from above. The other spoke upward, not for herself, but for millions who had been silenced in similar ways, and the world had seen which one carried weight. Crockett reminded the nation that dignity is stronger than arrogance. That calm courage disarms bluster. That leadership is not about how loudly you speak, but about how firmly you stand when the moment tests you. The emotional crescendo of it all crystallized in one realization: this wasn't just a clapback. It was proof that truth can silence even the loudest voices. For those who had felt belittled in classrooms, in workplaces, in government halls, this moment carried an almost spiritual resonance. It wasn't just politics. It was personal. It told people that when you stand rooted in integrity, even the loftiest titles and the sharpest tongues can falter before you. That was the moral. Crockett wanted the country to walk away with leadership. She insisted was never about intimidation. It wasn't about towering over opponents or drowning them in words. It was about integrity, the courage to tell the truth, to defend what's right, and to do so without losing your composure. And in that, Crockett's exchange became more than a viral clip. It became a blueprint, a reminder to students, activists, ordinary citizens: you don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to humiliate to win. If you carry yourself with dignity, if you anchor yourself in truth, you can shift the balance of a room and, maybe, just maybe, shift the direction of a nation. As Crockett herself reflected, history remembers the people who stand, not the people who sneer. And in that truth lay the resolution not of a trial, but of a lesson that would ripple far beyond Washington. One that belonged not to Crockett alone, but to everyone who ever found themselves speaking truth to power. And so, we circle back to the headline moment. Judge Amy Coney Barrett attacks Jasmine Crockett, and Crockett flips the entire trial. But here's the truth. She didn't flip it with rage. She didn't flip it with theatrics. She flipped it with calm, unshakable truth. That's the part that will echo far beyond this trial. In a political era filled with shouting matches and stage drama, Crockett offered something rare: dignity under fire. She didn't meet arrogance with arrogance. She met it with clarity. And that's why the room shifted. That's why the nation leaned in. Because at its core, this wasn't about a viral clip or a clever comeback. It was about the kind of leadership America desperately needs. Leaders who don't bend when pressed, who don't shrink when belittled, and who don't trade their integrity for applause. Leaders who stand firm, rooted in truth, no matter the weight pressing down on them. Jasmine Crockett showed that power doesn't only belong to those with titles or robes. Real power belongs to those who carry themselves with dignity, who can turn silence into strength, and who remind the nation that justice is not about intimidation, it's about truth. And now, that torch passes to you. If you believe in standing up to arrogance with dignity, if you believe truth still matters, then this is your call. Subscribe, share this story, let your voice be heard. Because the moment Crockett created in that chamber isn't just hers, it belongs to everyone. Who knows, the future of this nation depends on leaders and citizens who choose integrity over intimidation.